So Crimea is the decisive terrain. I mean, at the end of the day, this is about Crimea. And I think the Ukrainian General Staff sees this, and the Kyiv knows that Ukraine will never be safe or secure, nor will it ever be able to rebuild its economy as long as Russia occupies Crimea, because of their ability to reach and disrupt everything going in and out of Odessa, in and out of Azov Sea, in and out of Kherson. It provides a jumping off spot for the next conflict that Russia will start against Ukraine if they're not pushed out of there. So that's what this is about. Yeah, I don't know if Russia, if there is any leader that survived, kept his job, I mean, after a massive strategic failure. So I would imagine once Crimea is liberated, and there will be quite a power struggle that goes on inside the Kremlin.
Welcome, everyone. You're listening and watching Rashkin Report. My name is Yuri Rashkin, and I am very excited to welcome to our program Lieutenant General retired Ben Hodges, returning guest to this program. General, it's wonderful to see you back. Thank you for the time you found to be here.
Well, thanks for the privilege, Yuri, and I enjoyed the format and the discussion last time, so that's why I was grateful to get another opportunity.
Fantastic. Well, let's cut right to the chase. I've been gathering a lot of questions from our audience, many of whom live in Ukraine, and therefore the first set of questions I have is about the weapons. What do you see as the situation being right now? It seems like there's almost a watershed moment, possibly in Ramstein, and where do you see this headed, and perhaps how do we get there?
So I think the meeting in Ramstein tomorrow, maybe watershed is a good way to describe it. It's important because it's the first Ramstein contact group in the immediate aftermath of this terrible attack on Dnipro. They killed so many people this past weekend. And it's also the first meeting with the new German defense minister. So an opportunity for him to, on a global stage, to kind of clarify Germany's view, Germany's willingness to contribute in a significant way. And so it's important in that regard. I've seen so many different reports of things coming out, leaks or whatever, of good news coming from different quarters. So I think actually in some, it will be a very productive Ramstein contact group meeting tomorrow. The frustration, though, and almost obsessive attention on tanks is very interesting. I don't understand why the United States still is having a problem with delivering Abrams. I don't understand why Germany won't at least allow Poland, Finland, and other countries that have Leopard to give those. But you've got to put this in context. Tanks are important only when they're part of a larger armored formation with mechanized infantry, self-propelled artillery, engineers, all of those things. I believe that Ukrainian General Staff is attempting to build a large, powerful armored formation that will play a key role in the spring. So these tanks are not needed for now. They're needed for the spring as part of a breakthrough, if you will, that I believe will serve to isolate Crimea, the decisive terrain, from the rest of Russian occupied territory.
Do you feel that the United States actually has enough tanks that we could provide to address all the needs that Ukrainians have, or is this beyond our capabilities?
We absolutely have tanks. I mean, older models that would require refurbishment. So there's a variety of solutions, I think, that are out there that the Department of Defense would have to figure out how they would do it. And look, these are not like Toyotas that you just drive off the lot. Of course, there's significant maintenance requirement. Of course, they burn a lot of fuel. Of course, there's training, but the tone that I think that's come out about why the department does not want to provide Abrams comes across in a way condescending. Like we don't want to give the fuel burden to the Ukrainians, or there's so much maintenance required. It takes so long to train. And what we have seen for the past almost a year now is Ukrainian soldiers adapt to new technology as fast or faster than any other soldiers I've ever seen in my life. They will, like MacGyver, figure out how to solve fuel problems and how to employ this equipment. So let's give the capability necessary and stop whining about how much maintenance it is or how much fuel they're required. The Ukrainians will figure that out.
I think that understanding of the logic of how these decisions are made is important to our listeners as the answers to specific questions. In a sense, it's very interesting that you say that there's a condescending attitude in terms of turning over sophisticated technology to the natives. But what do you see as logic that is now changing? It seems that, again, watershed moment, more weapons. What happened?
I think that the White House and the Pentagon are perhaps gaining in some confidence that Ukraine can actually win. Many of us have believed this for quite some time, but I do believe that there has been a hesitancy out of an exaggerated fear of escalation, which I think is still there, unfortunately, but also not so certain that Ukraine could, at the end of the day, actually win this conflict. And so I think there was a reluctance to do something that might be seen as super provocative if it was not going to lead to confidence in a victory. So I think those factors have contributed to this. Now, of course, I don't have access to all information. This is not happening in a vacuum. I don't know what China is saying or what others are saying that causes the administration to tap the brakes on certain things. But what I would want to hear is for the administration, which has done a very good job otherwise, to say we want Ukraine to win and then deliver those things that are required for them to win.
What can Ukrainians do to increase flow of weapons? I found that to be a very interesting question, but people want to be, what can Ukrainians do?
Well, I don't know that there's something else that can be done. I am very confident that there are detailed discussions going on between the Ukrainian General Staff and the U.S. Joint Staff. So there's an understanding at a classified level of requirements and the situation on the ground that is much more detailed than what we should expect to see in public, number one. So I don't think that there's a misunderstanding about the requirement, but being consistent on that requirement, making that clear, obviously is an important part for Ukraine. And I think that we also need to make sure that I'm starting to sense a little bit of an alarmist tone that comes from Ukraine about, hundreds of thousands of new Russian troops are going to be mobilized on our northern border. I don't think so. I don't think that Russia will be able to do anything in or through Belarus. Nothing significant, large scale. I don't think that Russia has the ability to launch a major offensive that would constitute a breakthrough where you see one of these big long red arrows heading towards Kyiv or even Kharkiv. I don't think they have or will have the capability to do that for many months. And so I would caution against being too alarmist so that people don't become numb to that.
What impact do you foresee mobilization as having?
I think it's going to have, first of all, another negative effect inside of Russia. We saw last September almost 500,000 Russian military-age males left the country rather than get mobilized. So that tells you that there's not a good mood inside Russia about the idea of being mobilized. They're happy to cheer and say terrible things about Ukraine. They're less enthusiastic about actually putting on the uniform of Russian Federation forces and joining the fight. I don't think you'd find 10 soldiers, Russian soldiers today that are in Ukraine that actually want to be there. So another mobilization, I think, will put a lot of pressure on the domestic situation. And I think it would add a massive burden to an already fragile Russian logistics system. So we'll see there. On the other hand, of course, the Kremlin has demonstrated that they have zero compassion for how many of their own soldiers are killed. We see this every day, literally, how they're fed into the meat grinder. But as a Ukrainian friend told me, he says 100,000 untrained soldiers is still 100,000 soldiers. So that mass does have an effect, and it will occupy time and resources from the Ukrainian side.
In that angle, how do you view the private military armies of Prigozhin, and then there's supposedly others? There's like a new booming business of private armies in Russia. How do you see impact this having both on the battlefield and on society?
So this is an important question because, the United States also has depended on security companies for certain duties, guard, escort, these kind of things because of manpower limitations or for whatever reason. And we had to go through a process to make sure that whatever they were doing was in the was legal, and that it was not undermining efforts of actual units in country. The Russian private military company like Wagner, the most well-known, but you're right, there are some others. I think even Minister Shoigu has some sort of connection to one of these companies. It really highlights the incoherent structure of Russian forces, and also the incoherent command structure. The fact that they are still trying to figure out one joint operational commander responsible for the theater that integrates air, land, sea, special forces, all the other services. They haven't got that yet. And it's clear to me as an outsider, just using unclassified sources, Mr. Prigozhin, I'm sure, does not take his orders from the Ukrainian General Staff. He openly and publicly is constantly criticizing Shoigu and Gerasimov. So you've got a lack of coherence there. And then he complains that he doesn't get air support or other things for his troops while they're fighting. Well, yeah, because they're all basically in competition with each other. And then you've got Mr. Kadyrov with his Chechens. You don't hear too many reports of a lot of dead Chechens. In fact, I think he is, it seems to me that he's kind of biding his time, waiting to either be the savior or the successor, or to lead Chechnya in a third Chechen war to break away from the Russian Federation. And interestingly, of course, as soon as the announcement came out 2 days ago from General Gerasimov that all soldiers must be clean shaven, immediately pictures of Chechen soldiers popped up everywhere. So I don't know how they'll incorporate Chechen soldiers further.
So you see Kadyrov and his little, army playing an important role in this as well, even though they're not being talked about much.
I think that they're sitting on the sidelines. I mean, they're involved in some fighting, but he's got a fairly large group of soldiers, and the pictures I've seen of them, they all look well fed and well equipped. And but also, like I say, you hear and see very few reports of these guys being thrown into a meat grinder. I don't think that they're that much involved in the fighting. It doesn't seem like. So I think he is biding his time. He's been very critical of Gerasimov and Shoigu also.
How do you see the switch of the generals in the theater from Surovikin to Gerasimov? Is this something that you anticipate resulting in anything different in the battlefield, or is this just a result of some political infighting?
I think yes, and yes. When I first heard about it, I thought, okay, Surovikin has been sacked, and this is another thing. But as I've studied it more in the last few days, I think this was actually more about a reorganization they're still trying to figure out what is the best command structure. I think Surovikin probably ends up still being responsible for the day-to-day conduct, but it also puts Gerasimov in a very difficult and dangerous position. So now he owns it. He will be totally responsible. And I thought he would have been sacked many months ago. Same with Shoigu. But they've been such loyal members of Putin's sort of circle that they've been protected. But I think that this exposes General Gerasimov now to, if they don't accomplish the order, which was, I think, to secure all of Donbass by the 1st of March or something crazy like that, then it sets him up to be the fall guy. So I'm not a criminologist, so I'm not confident in speculating exactly how this all works out. But I think that it's going to be a very bright light shining on General Gerasimov.
I'll remind everyone that you're listening and watching Rashkin Report. And so press like, subscribe to this channel, distribute this video in your social media. And our guest today is Lieutenant General retired Ben Hodges, who served as Commanding General United States Army Europe. And I should always say thank you for your service. Let me ask you this. What about NATO? Again, kind of going back to the battlefield area of questions, do you see a set of circumstances under which NATO troops would get involved? I mean, you served, I believe you led 101st Airborne, and they're now in Romania, just down the street, it seems. Do you see a scenario under which NATO would get involved, boots on the ground?
At this point, I do not. I think that the last thing the Russians want is a conflict with NATO, and so it just seems extremely unlikely. There could be an accident or something could happen somewhere, but I think the alliance orders and discipline have been so clear to make sure that we don't somehow stumble into something ourselves. So no, I don't see it as likely because the Russians don't want it, and nor do we. And I think we are disciplined enough to avoid some sort of stupid mistake.
So this is really speaking of our discipline and restraint.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of scenario that people always worry about is airplanes colliding in each other. Russian aircraft get too close to U.S. aircraft, or ships getting too close or challenging each other. These sorts of things. And I think the alliance has done a good job of setting the conditions to avoid something like that happening.
What American or Western weapons are necessary for Ukraine to achieve its military goals? When last we spoke, you mentioned that rather than releasing numbers of how much more aid has been provided, we should be given some kind of a number of how much help is needed to accomplish the goal. Do you have a better understanding of where this is headed and what is needed for victory? So
Crimea is the decisive terrain. I mean, at the end of the day, this is about Crimea. And I think the Ukrainian General Staff sees this, and the Kyiv knows that Ukraine will never be safe or secure, nor will it ever be able to rebuild its economy as long as Russia occupies Crimea, because of their ability to reach and disrupt everything going in and out of Odessa, in and out of Azov Sea, in and out of Kherson. It provides a jumping off spot for the next conflict that Russia will start against Ukraine if they're not pushed out of there. So that's what this is about. So how do you compel Russia to leave the Crimean Peninsula? Of course, and your listeners know that there are only two roads, what we call lines of communication that connect Crimean Peninsula back to Russia or Russian occupied territory. One is the Kerch Bridge, of course, which has already been severely damaged, and I suspect that Ukraine will continue to make sure that that bridge never gets fully repaired. The other landline of communication is the so-called land bridge that runs from Rostov through Mariupol, Melitopol, and then down into Crimea. So only two roads. So actually, if Ukraine is able to isolate Crimea through long-range precision fires, and then eventually a ground assault towards Mariupol that severs these connections, then Crimea starts looking like a trap for Russian forces. And so this is why providing long-range precision fires. I think tomorrow we're going to hear about ground-launched small diameter bombs being part of the package. That will enable Ukraine to start hitting all along the land line of communication, bridges, transportation nodes, ammunition storage site, headquarters, to make that line of communication, to disrupt it. And if they had ATACMS, now the 300-kilometer rocket, they would be able to hit everything on the Crimean Peninsula. So Sevastopol, Jankoy, the logistics hub there, Saki, the airfield, and all the other places. So isolating Crimea through long-range fires and ground forces, severing that landline of communication, and then hitting targets on the Crimean Peninsula, making it untenable so that the Russians would have to leave it. That's how I think, and that's possible to happen, I think, by the end of the summer, if we deliver the capabilities that I just talked about.
That doesn't sound, though, like tanks are needed. Or is there a different part of the plan where tanks get involved?
Yeah, so sure. Tanks are absolutely needed as part of a larger armored force. I keep my map of Ukraine and the Black Sea handy all the time. And so if you can imagine that land line of communication I talked about, the so-called land bridge that runs from Rostov through Mariupol, Melitopol, and then down into Crimea. Mariupol, Zaporizhia, Melitopol, that would be the objective for a land force that's spearheaded by 2, 3, or 4 armored brigades. So an armored brigade that's made up of several battalions of tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, self-propelled artillery, all the kind of things that have been announced in the last few weeks, and which I anticipate will be coming over the next couple of months. I think the Ukrainian General Staff has actually been working on this for quite some time to build up an armored force using their own equipment, plus captured Russian equipment, and now Western delivered artillery, infantry fighting vehicles, and so on, would form these armored brigades. And that's the force that I think sometime in the spring, not anytime soon, but in the spring, would be used as part of the effort to isolate Crimea from the rest of Russian occupied territory.
And once again, it sounds like this is escalation now. That, United States and allies and Ukraine seem to be less concerned about Kremlin's response. What were some of those calculations based on that there would be a possibility of escalation? How did that such decisions are reached? That and then what is that we're afraid of specifically? Is this nuclear weapons and chemical weapons from Russia, or what?
Well, of course, you have to take the threat seriously when the Russians, and even I think earlier today, Medvedev said that if Russia faced a conventional defeat, they might have to use a nuclear weapon. So
are you saying Medvedev should be taken seriously?
No, what I'm saying is the threat should be taken seriously. That when so many people there from the Kremlin constantly talk about threat of nuclear war, they know that this affects how so many people think in the West, in Europe, as well as even in Washington, D.C. So in a way, their nuclear weapons are only effective if they don't actually use them. But I think it's unlikely that they would use them because President Biden has told them, he's warned them, he said there will be catastrophic consequences. And I think the Russian General Staff believes that. And I think the people around Putin also were thinking about life after him. And nuclear weapons do not give any sort of battlefield advantage to the Russians. I mean, it wouldn't change anything on the ground. It would just kill more innocent people and rubble some more towns, but it wouldn't change. It wouldn't give them an advantage. So that's why I think it's so unlikely they would do it. But if you go back to February, March, there was some hand-wringing about whether or not we should provide Javelin. I'm sorry, not Javelin, but Stinger, because it might provoke the Russians. And now here we are. We've been climbing the stairs for the past 11 months in a very incremental way. And there's nothing the Russians can do about it. I mean, when they say, if you deliver a Patriot, it's going to become a target. Well, no kidding. Of course it does. But that's their attempt to cause us, and it's been effective to some degree, that we have continued to deter ourselves on some of these things.
Does it mean that in a couple of steps we're going to be at F-16s?
I would not rule that out, but I think for me, the most important thing that we could announce would be ATACMS. That would be significant.
What is holding us back? Is it still the nuclear threat?
I think that, of course, as I said, I don't have all the information, so I'm having to do some speculation here and assessments based on reading of unclassified information. But none of this happens in a vacuum. I have to imagine that China has weighed in on some of this, and other countries perhaps. The administration has said that they're concerned about Ukraine launching strikes into Russia. And I think that was given as part of the reason why ATACMS would not be provided. But then just a couple of days ago, we heard the Undersecretary of Defense, Mr. Call from the United States, saying that the U.S. does recognize that Ukraine has a need to be able to protect itself from deep strikes coming out of Russia. I thought that was encouraging.
All right. Just for a second, looking at Washington, do you see timelines of budget and the next time Congress needs to vote on more help for Ukraine as any sort of a potential deadline to achieve results on battlefield?
That we've got some far right and far left extremists in the Congress that have raised concerns or voiced their opposition. But my sense is that the vast majority of the Congress, in a bipartisan way, continues to support what we're doing in support of Ukraine. I think most of them, thinking people, understand that American prosperity and security is tied directly to European prosperity and security, which depends on stability. And it depends on a international rules-based order where people obey international law. They respect human rights. They respect sovereign borders. So this is not just about Ukraine. This is about all of us. And also, people who think that China is a higher priority, I think most of them recognize that China is watching to see, can we do this? Can we stick together? Can we deliver capability to help Ukraine defeat Russia? If we can't do that, then I think the Chinese will not be terribly impressed with anything we say about Taiwan or South China Sea.
Do you feel that the message that we've been sending here inadvertently to Chinese is getting through?
I can't tell. China's got so many problems of their own right now with COVID and their economy and various other issues. I don't think they have any appetite for getting to a conflict with the U.S. or any of our allies in the Indo-Pacific region anytime soon. But we do know that President Xi communicated to the Kremlin that using nuclear weapons would be very bad, and even threatening the use of nuclear weapons would be very bad.
Last time we spoke, you mentioned that you just published an article about that we should be prepared for Russia falling apart. Been a couple of months, 2-3 months. How far along down that road both the Russia has come and your vision of what needs to happen and is likely to happen?
Yeah, I remain convinced. Let me say it differently. I remain concerned that we are not prepared for this possibility, that we have not thought through all the implications. And I think that possibility seems even more plausible than it did 4, 5, 6 months ago. When I look at the infighting and the backbiting between the various leaders, Kadyrov, Prigozhin, and others in and around the Kremlin, when I think about, how might the public react to another mobilization effort, When I think about the various ethnic regions of Russia away from Moscow and St. Petersburg, that they may see opportunity to decolonialize themselves, then I think it's very plausible. I'm not advocating for regime change. We have a bad record of that when we have tried to cause that ourselves. I'm just saying we need to think about the implications.
Do you think that Putin will be the one signing the peace treaty with Ukraine, or is this going to happen after Putin's been removed from the scene?
Yeah, I don't know if Russia, if there is any leader that survived, kept his job, I mean, after a massive strategic failure. So I would imagine once Crimea is liberated, and there will be quite a power struggle that goes on inside the Kremlin.
Historically, do you have any thoughts on the Budapest Memorandum? This is a point that is important to many historically minded viewers of ours.
Yeah, well, of course, this is going to be held up, and we're going to be reminded every hour on the hour until this is all done that we failed to live up to our obligations. That's the United States, the UK, and Russia.
And you view it as an obligation that we've had.
Yes, and we have failed to do that. And so I think that people will rightfully be skeptical about any sort of negotiated settlement that looks and smells anything like Budapest Memorandum. There's got to be a much more after Ukraine has recovered all of its sovereign territory, including Crimea, then whatever security arrangements and structures there are need to be more specific. And whatever the settlements are, we need to start from the point that Russia will not live up to any agreement that they sign unless they are forced to.
Well, General Ben Hodges, it's been a privilege and an honor to spend this time with you. Thank you so much. And we'll get to translating to get this information now to our Russian-speaking viewers and listeners all over the world. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Yuri, very much.
Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.